Giovanni Travaglino, and he's going to be talking to us about toxic masculinity and contact with the police in Italy.
Thank you very much. So I'll be talking about some work, well, hello everyone. I'll be talking about some work I conducted with Libby recently on contact with organized crime in Italy. First of all, what are criminal organizations? Well, those groups are extremely hard to define. There's a lot of literature that try to define them, but I just want to highlight one of the most important features, that they are not only economic enterprise groups whose aim is to try to accumulate resources, but they're also political groups, groups that have a political power and try to attain political power over the population. You can see some of their impact of their actions down there. They infiltrate local councils, have a huge economic impact in the regions where they operate, and also an impact worldwide. Now, one of the questions that I've been researching the past few years is how they manage to obtain the legitimacy that they do. Obviously, they cannot count on the same sources of legitimacy as the state does. So things like fairness or procedural fairness or other known source of legitimacies of institutional authorities. And my answer instead went back to Weber and this notion of traditional authority. Some groups in society have to base their legitimacy on their ability to match cultural values and traditions, on their ability to be able to present themselves as the embodiment of specific cultural values. And in the case of organized crime, that cultural value would be masculine honor. Masculine honor is basically a sub-aspect, a specific aspect of honor more in general, and has to do with being able to show yourself as being tough, able to exercise violence, self-reliance compared in relation to the state, so private revenge. In fact, criminal organizations tend to represent themselves as being the embodiment of those values, like men of honor and all the kind of narrative that they put around that. However, in order to exercise power, in order to be able to represent themselves to the population as being the embodiment of those values and obtain the consensus that they have in those areas, they have to have contact with the population. Those are naturally secret groups in the sense that they don't want to be found, because if they are found, they are usually arrested, hopefully. But they also have to have somehow contact. They must be recognized if they want to exercise power. So what we did with Libby was try to investigate some predictors of intergroup contact with members of those groups among the population. We know that there are some personality traits and social attitudes that predict, that might influence the kind of experience of contact that people search for. We also propose that cultural values, masculine honor being one of those cultural values, might influence people's willingness to engage in contact with specific groups. Cultural value, they usually provide a template to organize the reality. They tell people what is important and what is appropriate to do. And therefore, they also can tell people which kind of group is appropriate to have interaction with. So our hypothesis in the set of studies that I'm going to present, it's the masculine honor, people endorsement of these masculine honor values make people more likely to engage in contact with members of criminal organizations. I will be going a bit lightly on details because the time is limited, but I try to represent three empirical studies, first showing the association between masculine honor and the group contact longitudinally, then exploring the implication of this contact, and finally testing whether the relationship between masculine endorsement of masculine honor values and different types of contact, different balance of contact. Well, one important thing I have to say about the methodology is that masculine honor is measured with ideological items. Basically, those are not items telling people, asking people how much they personally enact masculine honor, but how much they find masculine honor appropriate. So, for example, to what extent a man should behave in a certain way. So those are items that basically can be answered both by male and female. We, as always, obtain a main effect of gender in the sense that men are more likely to endorse those items more strongly, but female might endorse them as well. And the connections therefore hold also for gender here. They're all controlled for gender. So in the first study we surveyed around 176 people, actually kids aged around 16 years old, across 2 waves of this with 5 months distance between them. And we showed the masculine honor at time 1 predicted frequency of contact with members of criminal organization after 5 months, whereas the opposite effect was much smaller, did not reach significance. In the second study, we explored some implication of this contact, including what basically we call the tendency to romanticize those groups. So basically the idea that once you spend time with members of those groups, you see them as embodying the history of the region, as being more able to as deserving respect, and so on and so forth. I think it was 3 items to measure. And you can see in orange there the indirect effect. People that endorse masculine honor ideology, they are more likely to report more frequent contact with members of those groups, which then lead them to romanticize them, to see them in a more positive light. As you remember, I told you at the beginning, the process of romanticization, the idea that those groups are able to embody those norms and those values is extremely important for them to achieve legitimacy. So here contact seem to be doing exactly that, to basically showing them that they actually are a match for those cultural values. And finally, we explore a different balance of contact and its effects on mobilization against those groups, what we call anti-mafia activities. And we here, it's a model, it's a bit complicated, but you can find the 2 main indirect effects. So basically people that endorse masculine honor ideology, they tend to have more positive contact with those groups that reduce the threat that they perceive from those groups, as well as increase the tendency. So I'm talking in a causal language, but those are not really causal relationships. So as well as the tendency, increase the tendency to romanticize those groups. And finally, these lead to either more or less collective action intention to mobilize against those groups. The connection between masculine honor and negative contact is not significant, it's much smaller, did not reach significance. However, negative contact members of those groups, people that had the negative contact with them, they were also more likely to perceive more threat from members of those groups. No link between, actually, sorry. Yes, they had no link between negative contact and the tendency to romanticize those groups. And finally, negative contact affect the collective action intention indirectly through the perceived threat. So basically, it seems that people that endorse masculine honor ideology, they tend to have more positive contact, which then reduce threat and increase the tendency to romanticize those groups, which then leads to more or less collective action depending on the kind of construct, whereas negative contact does not take place in the same shared understanding, the same shared cultural values. It's something that has nothing to do with, or has less to do with people's endorsement of masculine honor ideology. So that's basically about those 3 studies. I think that there are couple of takeaway messages. One is that cultural value, before we were talking about norms, right? So where those norms come from. And cultural value might be an important source of those norms. Then I can tell people which kind of group is appropriate to have contact with. And in this specific case, cultural norms of masculine honor might make contact with people, with members of organized crime more acceptable. And as I was mentioning before, as the positive contact takes place in the shared framework, in the shared understanding, the shared norms, negative contact is not the same. We still don't know which kind of experience or which kind of norms or social attitudes predict this negative contact. Finally, I mean, this research is still very much at its early stages, but the implication, if confirmed further on with experimental studies or more longitudinal studies, seem to be that simple interventions, which nowadays take place, just keeping the kids off the street, are not sufficient. We just also need to confront the more perhaps substantial question of the values involved in contact with members of the population and members of criminal organizations. So I haven't had much time talk about the methodological details, but you can find the papers there, and thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for one question. Again, we might have questions later. Can you join me in thanking Giovanni? Thank you.